speaker from the three, who I'll now introduce, is Bob Jackson, a filmmaker, author and lecturer at the Munster Technological University in Ireland. He is currently working towards the completion of a PhD in film and screen media creative practice at University College Cork, and is also currently working on a live-action drama series with the support of Screen Ireland. Today, Bob is reading his paper based on a true story, Cinematic Approaches to the Past. Welcome, Bob.
So, first of all, I'd like to thank Ramisha and Patricia and all of the panel for organising this event, this conference. It's a huge honour to be here and to share some of my research with you. Just, I suppose, in a general sense, I love coming to these types of events because I just had some fantastic conversations with a number of individuals today. And I always get, it's great to discuss your research because people, you know, they give you a name for books and contacts and so on. So I'd really like to thank you for inviting me here today. So, just to give you a bit of background to my research, so my PhD is titled Based on a True Story, Cinematic Approaches to the Past. And I suppose to summarise what I will be discussing today, my research centres on the process by which historical events or individuals and their stories are presented on screen. There is always a conflict or there's a controversy in the process through which that translation takes place. And it's something that has been around as long as cinema has been around. So, you know, cinema is barely 100 years old, but since its earliest days, historical material has always been a central part of the cinematic tradition. And when that process takes place, historians invariably have issues with the way in which the historical material is presented and so on. So the goals of my research then are to try to try to develop an ethical approach to presenting history on screen. In all of the case studies that I've been working on, the main issue for me is what is the contemporary relevance of these historical stories. So there's two that I'll discuss with you today, one in detail. One is a documentary about a story that happened nearly 350 years ago, but the legacy of that period still lives on today. The other story is related to an Irish doctor who ended up in Nagasaki when the atomic bomb was dropped. So there is a contemporary relevance to that. But for me personally, and as a researcher, one of the, I suppose my main interest in all of these historical stories is what do they mean for the way we live today and to the way we interact and so on. But the issues which arise in that difficulty between accuracy and entertainment and fact versus fiction, they have been around as long as cinema has been around. History, and I put that in a capital H, it claims to be objective, but cinema by its nature and storytelling by its nature must be subjective in order to connect with the audience. My research then has followed a number of different directions. I began by researching narrative structure in the context of storytelling and its place in human culture and human society, which goes back, many would argue, it goes back to Aristotle, 2,300 years ago. He wrote Poetics to try to understand the nature of storytelling, what is the essence of storytelling, and what do stories need to have, and so on. The principles which Aristotle developed 2,300 years ago are as relevant today as they were 2,300 years ago. And those storytelling devices and techniques and so on are essential in order to tell a story which can, number one, connect with the audience, and number two, a major concern with regards to filmmaking is budgetary concerns. So it's a very real issue for filmmakers, and I would fall within both categories as a historian and as a filmmaker. But in order to get funding to make a documentary or to make live action drama, which is far more expensive, there are certain criteria which must be met, and those institutions and so on who provide the funding expect a story to be told. Now, that can be a double-edged sword in such a way that it requires the filmmaker to possibly manipulate the story and to tell it in a certain way that it can be filmed. And for example, and I've encountered this in my work, where you might have, let's say, 4 different locations, but if some of the material, the events which happened in those locations is broadly similar, when creating a fictionalized version or when presenting that on screen, you have to just condense those 4 locations down to 1. Or if you have a number of different characters who have the same influence on the story, to avoid repetition, and from a narrative perspective, that's essential. So to avoid that level of repetition and to engage with the audience and make sure that they remain engaged, it's essential that you tell the stories a particular way. Now, a historian would view that as heretical, that you must stick with the facts, and if there's any deviation from exactly what happened from a historical perspective, there are many academics, historians with a capital H, who would have an issue with that. Now, I would fall within both of those categories as an academic and as a practitioner. So that's where my research has brought me and so on. But I've been working on these kind of things for many years. So as part of my PhD then, I've done a huge amount of research into narrative structure and so on, into screenwriting and screencraft in the context of cinematography, editing, lighting, sound, music, and so on. In parallel with that, I continue to develop a lot of my expertise in historical research. So one of the things which is essential for the filmmakers, that they become well versed in the historical materials. So the available resources that are out there to inform your opinion of the period, it's essential that you grasp those and engage with them so that you're able to improvise with those details. Now, and also best practice with regards to filmmaking and so on in this context. So I have 2 case studies that I've been working on. One is a documentary and one is a live action drama. So it's a series based on a documentary which I made a number of years ago called A Doctor's Sword. The dramatized version is called A Doctor's War. That tells the story of an Irish doctor who joined the RAF at the beginning of World War II. He ended up in Dunkirk. He was sent to Asia, where he was captured by the Japanese, spent nearly 4 years as a POW of the Japanese. He spent the last year of the war in Nagasaki, and he was less than a mile when the atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. He was the first non-Japanese doctor to assist civilians in the aftermath of the atomic bomb, and he saved a lot of lives in the aftermath of the atomic bomb. His name is Dr. Aidan McCarthy. So I made a documentary about his experiences that was released in Irish cinemas in 2015. I subsequently wrote a book. So I went through the process of researching the history and the story from a historical perspective. But through making a documentary, I really engaged with that situation where you really have to simplify the story to get it down to 70, 80, 90 minutes. Now, when a person sees the documentary, it's the emotional connection. When you speak to an editor, that's the thing that they will emphasize, that is most important. It's the emotional connection between the audience and the subject. So in this type of an area where it's creative and it's practice as well, you have different guiding principles for various individuals, whether they're editors, directors, composers, and so on. Now, my other case study then is a documentary. Now, it's provisionally titled Red Legs. Now, this is, I'll just move on to this clip here now, just keep an eye on the time. So, this documentary is a story which I came across a number of years ago in relation to Irish people who were transferred to the Caribbean during the 1600s. It's a complex history, and a lot has been written about it, and in many ways it has often been misrepresented. So I'd just like to show you a clip. It's about maybe 4.5 minutes. We'll give you a good idea of the story, and I'll go into it in a little bit more detail then after you see this.
we have been able to trace things back to the original Kennedys that came to Barbados in the 1600s. It's quite a story. There were all kinds of problems in Ireland, as we all know around that time. It's almost like the Irish history is erased on the island. I feel when I went to school in Barbados, it was all about the English did this and the English did that. But we would never know because the Irish weren't keeping the records.
Yeah.
So the records were being kept by the British, so you don't really know how much influence there was. And even with the plantations, what actually happened with Irish people that were involved in there, we don't really have. We're still researching that.
The only people who know are the older people.
The older people seem to know.
And they don't keep records, obviously.
There's a very good oral history of Barbados.
Yeah.
A lot of what we know is from what people have been talking about and handing down.
Barbados was a prison colony, that the English sent prisoners down here. Some came at the indenture, but like the man said, the indenture paper wasn't worth the paper it was written on. So it's indenture said when you work for 5 years, and after 5 years, you get a piece of land. And we never
Oh, especially with postage, so that after those.
You see the land we didn't have, the rab land, what they call it, the land that the plantation didn't want. It was reserved for poor people like we.
And a lot of sickness killed a lot of the ancestors too. So you see, we're hard-working people and all these things, somebody we are very resilient. We thought that we'd been dead, but we're still alive.
Barbados, through the Barbados slave owners, they become the wealthiest men in the hemisphere through the very successful production and exportation of sugar. And whereas the Irish and blah, blah, blah are a bloody people and blah, 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 and should not be treated under the same laws as the English, and they are separate people, and we don't trust you, you're Catholic, you're against us Protestants, you're the Anglo-French wars, the Irish were being accused of being traitors, the enemy within, giving intelligence information to the French, the commitment to the French king. The Irish revolted and established a tradition of rebellion, as so did the Africans. So we had two cultures of violent rebellion against the English, and there's an intersection when these two struggles came together.
As we go down this rabbit hole and we dig more and more, we're finding out more things. Some of the historians are saying there were, the Irish were involved and working with the Africans and different things. And so we don't really have. It does need to be researched more, and I think there's a lot more to find out. And some of these actual plantations have records that have not been looked at. We just have to uncover them.
So, I put that together with the intention of including it with funding applications. So it's basically like a teaser clip for the proposed documentary. Now, it's really just to give people a flavour of what the story is about and what the history is about from that period. But basically, that clip and that documentary, by the time it's finished, the intention is to develop an ethical approach to presenting history on screen while exploring a little-known period of colonial history and its legacy. Now, I'm often surprised when I discuss this topic with people even in Ireland who've never heard of this. They're not aware of the historical connections between Ireland and the Caribbean. But in Barbados, on the east coast of Barbados, living in abject poverty in wooden shacks and so on. There's a community. It's only about 400 of them left, and they live with all of the attendant difficulties of people who live in marginalisation for generations. They have, poor, the sickness and education, unemployment, lack of confidence, alcoholism, and so on. It's something that's repeated around the world, but it's very unusual in the Caribbean story to come across a community like that. And they're victims of the system that they live within. Their story has been hijacked by a lot of right-wing media outlets, especially in the US, where it's referred to as the white slave myth. And the basic thesis goes that, the Irish were the first slaves. And you find this stuff, you find numerous incidents of this and articles about this on the internet, on social media and so on. And they propose that the Irish were the first slaves, that there was, I came across one account that said that there were more Irish slaves than there were African slaves. Just totally off the wall nonsense, all right? But it's used as a device to undermine efforts towards creating more racial justice in America. And the attitude being that, the Irish just got on with things and they didn't hold them back and they just got on with things and, aren't they doing great enough for themselves? They dusted themselves off. That's the attitude of the likes of Bill O'Reilly, who used to be on Fox News and so on. That's what they present, okay? Now, what I would say is that the red leg community are emblematic of the fact that it's the societal circumstances within which a community or people live that determine their outcomes and their prospects. And that's, I suppose, the contemporary relevance that I would see in this documentary. But basically, you have three storylines running there. But back to the topic then, that you have the Redlegs, this community, have a very strong emotional connection to Ireland, and it's to try to figure out what that is. So there's routes that this might go down would be, one, for example, would be a DNA test with the Department of Genetics in University College Cork. So to do it ethically and with the right, to do it appropriately, just to try to uncover exactly what are the links between both countries. And I mentioned the contemporary relevance again. So with this story then you have three storylines. You have a Barbadian family who now live in Galway and they're searching for their roots. So Ian and Maisie, you saw them at the start. Their ancestor left Ireland in 1650 and they have a fascinating family story. But they work in the games industry. They're from programming background. They're very, educated, well-to-do and so on. The other side of the Atlantic, you have the Norris family who live in wooden shacks, abject poverty and so on. They have this emotional connection. So it would be a case of trying to tell both families' stories and then the history kind of woven into that. So Professor Sir Hilary Beckles is the world authority on that. And he has evidence, he has in his publications has come across incidents where African slaves in Barbados in the 1600s and Irish indentured servants orchestrated and organised acts of rebellion. In most cases, they were uncovered before they were able to enact those acts of rebellion. But it is a fascinating story that hasn't been told. And I have yet to come across many people who know about that. So it's a case of trying to bring events from 3.5 centuries ago into the contemporary realm and to make it engage with an audience, which is a challenge then, obviously, as well. So the story and the way it will be told would use cinematography, so static cinematography for the Norris family, because they are stuck in that situation, more dynamic, free-moving cameras for the Brathwaite family, because they're mobile, they're global citizens and so on. The animation style, you would have seen a couple of these illustrations from a series from the 1600s by Jacques Callot, a French lithographer from a series called The Miseries of War. That's recorded as the first anti-war art series, and I would use this style of imagery for the animation. So when events from the 1600s are being discussed, if you could imagine this being animated and the camera moving through this scene while you're telling the story of events from the 1600s, to our contemporary eyes, this image is cartoonish. It's like this is what we associate with cartoons, but you can see the gruesomeness of what is taking place in what has been represented. So the take that I would like to take with this would be that to bring the history to life, obviously there's no archive footage from the 1600s, so you need to bring it to life. The only other way is recreations, reenactments, but that's hugely expensive and it usually doesn't work out very well. So that's the approach. I've done this before for the documentary about Aidan McCarthy then as well. So moving towards, back to the theory side of things then, Michelle, how am I doing on time? So from 1976, one of the theorists that I've done a lot of research on made the point, maybe 46, 7 years ago, that in the future it may be possible to present historical topics on TV in terms of problems and interpretations to be examined rather than assumed truths to be conveyed in a pseudo-authoritative commentary and provide facilities for the critical discussion of historical programs. Now, leading on from that, you have cross-media techniques. So usually when a documentary, maybe it's an hour and a half in length, while working on a documentary, you might interview someone for an hour and use 6 minutes of that interview. But using very easily available technologies, websites and so on, you can make the full unedited interview available. So if somebody engages with the material through a story being told in a documentary format, 1 hour, 90 minutes or so on, if they're interested in it, then they can go further. They go to the original sources. And I've come across a huge number of primary sources, secondary sources, and so on, which can be digitized, made available, discussion about those, the more nuanced aspects of the story and so on, and it's all very, very accessible. So that's part of the, I suppose, manifesto that I would work towards as I complete my PhD, to try to present that as a method of using what is available today to overcome what was outlined 40 odd years ago as being a difficulty with regards the history on film and so on. So they are my main research findings to date. And as I mentioned at the start, the filmmaker must become completely immersed in the history in order to be able to improvise with the story, to be able to present it on, to go through that translation. If somebody was translating from French to English, they'd need to be fluent in that, and that's one of the essential recommendations that I would make. And I better wrap it up there, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker for today, Crystal L. Edwards, who is an assistant professor and program coordinator in the African Studies Department at San Francisco State University. She will be reading from her paper titled "From Which I Draw My Strength," Audre, Eartha and Frida, highlighting the unique ways Audre Lorde, Eartha Kitt and Frida Kahlo utilised their voice to not only challenge social structures and power dynamics, but to overcome them and create the lives that they desired. So, welcome. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me at this amazing event. When I think about the statement, "when I dare to be powerful," right? That is a very demanding statement. And so when I came across this conference, I knew that this would be my opportunity to discuss these three amazing women that I don't really get to talk about very often, not in conversation with one another. And so my presentation today is going to be based on my research thus far on a working article that seeks to achieve three goals. The first of which is to expand the existing literature of Black queer studies, particularly Black queer feminism. The second goal is to highlight the monumental work of three women from the global majority that were not only creatives, but also social justice advocates in their own right. And to utilize the lessons and the third one is to utilize the lessons and experiences of the three women who influenced my praxis as I, a Black queer woman, navigates the often volatile and unwelcoming space that is American higher education. So in today's discussion, I'm going to focus on the first two goals of this project, but I do welcome questions around the third. in the Q&A section. So historically, women color have been denied our humanity, our womanness, and our value. And from the exploitation and sexual violence that was perpetuated during enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade to the continued psychological damage done through harmful media messaging, erasure, and appropriation, women of color have continued to resist through time and space. And that is the focus of this work, to highlight the ways in which three women, Audre Lorde, Eartha Kitt, and Frida Kahlo, utilized their voices to not only challenge social structures and power dynamics, but to overcome them and create the lives that they desired. Utilizing Black queer feminism as my theoretical framework, I'll explore the themes of self-definition, self-love, and social activism. So who are these women? So Audre Lorde, I'll start with the discussion of Audre Lorde, which is in this far corner if you're not familiar. Born Audre Geraldine Lorde, she dropped the Y from her name at a young age because she didn't like writing the tail and preferred the evenness of Audre Lorde. She self-identified as a Black feminist, lesbian, mother, poet. Lorde was born in New York City on February 18th of 1934. Early on, she was drawn to poetry and writing, so much so that that was her preferred means of communication and self-expression. Even as a child, she did not speak until the age of 5, and she was inspired by a short story that was read by a local librarian. When she could no longer find the words to express herself in existing literature, she began to write. She would go on to publish 11 volumes of poetry and 5 works of prose and various other essays, beginning with her first publication in 17 magazine while she was still in high school. Lorde's work and activism tackled the realities of injustices of racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia. Until her transition as a result of cancer, Lorde continues to call out injustice and fight against oppression in the U.S. and abroad. Audre Lorde's self-proclamation as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet demonstrates her awareness of the complexities of identity and the impact that those identities have on our experience within the global context. Eartha Kitt, which is in the far left, my left. Eartha Mae Kitt was born on January 17th of 1927 in South Carolina. Her mother, Annie Mae Heath, later Annie Mae Riley, was Cherokee and African American. Although Kitt had little knowledge of her white father, it was reported that he was the son of the owner of the farm who she was born, and that he had conceived her through rape. Her mother soon went on to live with a Black man who refused to accept Eartha because of her relatively pale complexion. Consequently, Kitt lived with relatives, particularly one named Aunt Rosa, who abused her. After the death of Aunt Rosa, she went to go live with with Mamie Kitt in Harlem, New York, and she was introduced to the arts while attending Metropolitan Vocational High School. Kitt began her career as a member of the Catherine Dunham Company in 1943 and remained a member of the troupe until 1948. She went on to perform, record music, star in various films and television series. She spoke 4 languages, German, Dutch, English, and French, and she sang in 11 different languages. Frida Kahlo, whose name was born Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderon, was born July 6th of 1907 to a German father and a mestiza mother. Frida Kahlo was a Mexican painter known for her many portraits, particularly her self-portraits, and the works inspired by nature and artifacts of Mexico. Through native folk art, she explored Mexican identity, post-colonialism, gender, class, and race, using the country's popular culture. In addition to belonging to the post-revolutionary Mexicano movement, which sought to define a Mexican identity, she is also known for painting about her experience of chronic pain, which was the result of lasting effects of having polio at the age of 6 and being severely injured in a bus accident at the age of 18. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, while traveling in Mexico and the United States, Kahlo developed her artistic style, drawing inspiration mainly from Mexican folk art, Mexican folk culture, and mostly painted small self-portraits combining Catholic beliefs and elements from pre-Columbian culture. Surrealist artist Adrian Andre Brenton and elements from pre-Columbian culture. Her paintings were noticed, and the artist Andre arranged for a solo exhibition of hers at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York in 1938. And the show was a success, and so that it was followed by another show in Paris in 1939, which was not as successful, but the Louvre acquired Kahlo's paintings, and the frame became, their purchasing of the frame made her the first Mexican-American artist in their collection. And she also worked as a teacher and participated in exhibitions in Mexico and the United States during the 1940s. She was a founding member of Seminario de Cultura Mexicana, and she taught the National School of Painting, Art, and Sculpture. Kahlo was already in a fragile health condition throughout her life, but that continued to deteriorate. And shortly after her first solo exhibition in Mexico in 1953, she passed away. It was Kahlo's interest in politics and art that led her to join the Mexican Communist Party in 1927, and she has come to represent nonconformity both with regards to gender and sexuality. So when I talk about, in the development of this paper, I'm primarily using Black queer feminism as my theoretical framework, as the lens in which I'm analyzing these different women's experiences. So I want to talk a little bit about Black queer feminism. So in the article, Black queer feminism, Mecca Sullivan provides the definition of Black queer feminism as it relates to the connection between race and gender. And Black queer feminism is an expansion of existing modes of feminism and queer LGBTQIA+ activism. Black queer feminism is able to highlight the existing connections of racial, gendered, and heterosexist oppression through its intersectional approach. It is important to note that Black lesbian women have always been instrumental in Black feminism, and particularly in the creation of this distinct theoretical perspective and lens. And whenever I'm referencing this, I'm thinking back to the National Black Feminist Organizations that were founded in 1973 that had an explicit focus on the challenge of Black lesbian women. And also the Combahee River Collective that was founded in 1975, that was founded by Black lesbian women, right? And so the goal of Black queer feminism is a lens to provide an antidote to the too often silenced but fierce clash of class, race, and sexuality, the emergence of critical theories that fail to represent Black queer women. Further, Black queer feminism provides an active challenge to existing academic discourse in the U.S., sexuality studies and theory, in which issues of recognition, theorizing difference, acquiring resources, visibility, and representation, as well as ultimately institutional power, is at the helm of the concerns for Black queer feminism. Lastly, Black queer feminism is also focused on establishing a counter-narrative that establish alternative forms of power, and does not reinscribe silence, but engenders speech, desire, and agency. So, a key theme in the review of these three women's work, and a primary draw of my interest, is the fact that all three women were dedicated to self-determination and self-definition, a bold statement in a largely patriarchal society. One of my absolute favorite quotes by Audre is, quote, "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive," end quote. And she said this in 1982 address entitled Learning from the 60s. The concept of self-definition is evident throughout Lord's work. She highlights, she asserts that as an African-American woman, I feel the tragedy of being an oppressed, hyphenated person in America, of having no land to be our primary teacher, and this distorts us in so many ways. As such, our agency is in self-definition. That's what gives us power. She also talks about, in her work, transformation of silence into language and action. Lord positions silence as the antithesis of asserting one's agency and power over of self-definition and self-determination. She states that we have been socialized to respect fear more than our own needs for language and definition. And while we wait for silence for that final we wait in silence for the final luxury of fearlessness, the weight that silence will choke us again affirming the imperative of defining oneself for oneself. I posit that her opening poem of The Black Unicorn, bearing the same name, Lorde describes the experience of Black women as a Black woman. She does not rely on the description or assertions of others. She presents her experience as a Black woman as complex, unique, and dynamic. In direct attempts to make Black women invisible or to, quote, mistaken them for shadows or symbols, end quote, Lorde centers Black women in this work and in her other work. So similarly, Frida Kahlo also was very adamant about self-definition. Unabashed in her sexual identity, throughout her life, Kahlo made no secret of her sexuality. She openly identified as a bisexual woman in a time that discussing sexuality was in fact taboo. She was defiant of expected gender roles of the time, refusing to be held back because she was a woman. She often borrowed her father's books to intellectually enrich herself as an independent woman and a political activist. She also experimented with gender expression by occasionally wearing men's clothes and adopting a masculine posture. Kahlo's unapologetic self-identification and expression demonstrated her subscription to self-definition. So self-love. So similar to self-definition, the concept of self-love shows up heavily in the life stories of all three women. Particularly today, I'm going to discuss Eartha Kitt and Frida Kahlo. Eartha Kitt, particularly throughout her life, she was not only known for her skilled performances, but she was also known for her public relationships and her commentary on self-love and resistance to compromise. Famously, she asserts, it's all about falling in love with yourself and sharing that love with someone who appreciates you, rather than looking for love to compensate for a self-love deficit. In another commonly shared interview clip, Kitt discusses relationships and questions compromise.
Can anyone live with Eartha Kitt?
That's not for me to decide. Not for someone who decides to live with me to decide. Not for me.
But are you willing to compromise within a relationship?
To compromise? What is compromising? Compromising for what? Compromising for what reason? To compromise for what? To compromise. What is compromise?
If a man came into your life, wouldn't you want to compromise?
Stupid. A man comes into my life and I have to compromise? You must think about that one again. A man comes into my life and you have to compromise for what? For what? For what? A relationship is a relationship that has to be earned, not to compromise for. And I love relationships. I think they're fantastic. They're wonderful. I think they're great. I think there's nothing in the world more beautiful than falling in love. But falling in love for the right reasons, falling in love for the right purpose, falling in love, falling in love. When you fall in love, what is there to compromise about?
Isn't love a union between two people? Or does Eartha fall in love with herself?
I think if you were to think about it in terms of analyzing, yes, I fall in love with myself and I want someone to share it with me. I want someone to share me with me.
Has that happened?
Bye, Waylon! Bye! many times, in many ways.
So in this clip, Kit asserts the imperative of self-love as one of her fundamental tenets, highlighting that one of the most important relationships we all have is a relationship that we have with ourselves. Frida Kahlo, in a similar vein, I posit, also demonstrates the significance of one's relationship with self in her utilization of self-portraiture. She famously said, I paint myself because I am so often alone and because I am the subject I know best. Particularly, her depiction of herself with a unibrow and a mustache served as a clear defiance of society's definition of feminine beauty. Social activism. In addition to being drawn to these women for their outspoken perspective of self-definition and self-love, all three of the women demonstrated a commitment to social justice through activism, demonstrating the rejection of Eurocentric conceptualization of art for art's sake. The women utilized their artistic expression and fame to make statements in an effort towards social change in a myriad of ways. Audre Lorde was a global activist. She was among the founders of the Women's Coalition of St. Croix, an organization dedicated to assisting women who have survived sexual abuse and intimate partner violence. In the late 1980s, she also helped establish Sisterhood in Support of Sisters, SISA, in South Africa, to benefit Black women who were affected by apartheid and other forms of injustice. In 1985, she was a member of a delegation of Black women and writers that were invited to Cuba. She raised critical questions about the impact of the Cuban Revolution on the ongoing issues of anti-Blackness, racism, and homophobia. And then from 1984 to 1992, Lorde was a visiting professor in West Berlin at the Free University of Berlin. During her time, she was influential in her support of Afro-German women, encouraging them to utilize writing as a tool of resistance against racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, classism, and homophobia. Eartha Kitt, in 1950s and 1960s, she was engaged in numerous social causes. In 1966, she established the Kittsville Youth Foundation, which was a nonprofit organization serving underprivileged youth in Watts. Additionally, she was involved with a group of youth in Washington, D.C. at Castio who called themselves Rebels with a Cause. This organization focused on efforts to clean up the streets and establish recreational areas. She was also a member of the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. Her criticism of the Vietnam War and its connection to poverty and racial unrest in 1968 can be seen as her larger commitment to peace activism. One of her most notable moments was during her visit to the White House for a luncheon. She was asked about the Vietnam War by former First Lady Lady Bird Johnson, and she stated, "You send the best of this country off to be shot and maimed. No wonder the kids rebel and take pot." She continued, "The children of America are not rebelling for no reason. They are not hippies for no reason at all. We don't have what we have on Sunset Boulevard for no reason. They are rebelling against something. There are so many things burning the people of this country, particularly mothers. They feel they're going to raise sons and they know what it's like. And you have children of your own, Miss Johnson. We raise children and send them to war." Eartha Kitt was also a avid supporter of LGBTQ rights. In one of the quotes, she demonstrated her camaraderie by saying, "We are all rejected people. We know what it is to be refused. We know what it is to be oppressed, depressed, and then accused, and I am very much cognizant of that feeling. Nothing in the world is more powerful than rejection. I am a rejected, oppressed person, and I so understand them as best as I can, even though I am a heterosexual." Frida Kahlo was also very political throughout her life. She was a member of Chachuas, which is an organization affiliated with Marxism. She was introduced to socialism as a student at the National Preparatory School. She also was part of the Young Communist League. She also utilized political themes in her paintings. Her paintings touched on female issues such as abortion, miscarriages, birth, breastfeeding, and much more. And there were things that were considered to be strictly taboo and never spoken of at all in public back then. And so by way of conclusion, I just want to close with Audre Lorde's words from her essay, Turning the Beat Around, Lesbian Parenting in 1986. If there is any lesson we must teach our children, it is that difference is creative force for change, that survival and struggle for the future is not a theoretical issue. It is the very texture of our lives, she says. My daughter and my son made issue of survival daily questions, the answers to which had to be scrutinized as well as practiced. And what our children learned about using their own power and difference within our family, I hope they will someday use to save the world. I can hope for no less.
Very much, and so I'm really forward to the conversation we generate in this Q&A. I have to be moving the next one. I said it was today from my son. Yeah. So Samaneh is joining us from Palestine to talk about the voice of change via artwork in Palestine and the UK. With the first unlikely artwork dealing with Palestine and Britain. As a woman living under Israeli occupation, she highlights the challenges of daily life in Palestine and aims to deconstruct and analyze some important questions about voice and art in her paper today, titled The Voice of Change Through Artwork in Palestine and in British Banksy's artwork at the case study. Let's get out.
First is good for some. Is it with some check?
Okay, hi everyone.
It's great. So now you get your slides up.
Okay.
There is. Yes, we'll just have the narrow up innovation.
Yeah. Hello everyone. What I get from about for my visa was rejected due to ongoing the Palestinian persecution. So welcome to my virtual presentation. And research questions, the science's aim to expose injustice by amplifying silenced voices. Do his artworks effectively represent victims around the world? Is this approach aligned with the principle of cosmopolitanism, serving as a means to change and reconstruct the world? Additionally, it is essential to examine how Banksy's artworks contributed the reconstruction of the world within a cosmopolitan system. Furthermore, attention should be given to the influence of the artworks industry and its sustainability to culture communication. To what extent do these factors impact or the creation of artwork? Can these artworks be seen as a reflection of an imagined future seeking justice? Moreover, it is curricular to explore the influence of dominant system and colonial structuralism on the industry. Finally, can the artwork be separated from habitus, considering their intertwined existence? Specialists believe that the cultural system, including various forms of artwork, has undergone radical transformation that continue the shape its evaluation. In line with this perspective, the present study adopts an analytical approach focusing specifically on Banksy's artworks in Palestinian and Britain by reconstructing and analyzing selected artworks. The study aims to investigate whether the voice of artwork can effectively express the experience of victims and potentially instigate global change. This study employs a constructive and analytical approach, examining various aspects, including authority, culture, communication, and the underlying structure and sources of the artworks. By exploring these interconnected facts, a comprehensive understanding of the complexity surrounding the Banksy's artworks can be attained. Banksy artworks initially emerged on walls and later expanded to campus, gallery space, hotels, museums, and actually marking the growth of an industry. This industry effectively transforms scenes depicting violence, injustice, colonialism, and nuance into satirical art. Banksy's distinctive thematic approach envelopes ridiculing regulation, restriction, and systems of authority. As a result, the scenes of colonial violence became splayed artworks incorporated into Banksy's portfolio. Banksy aims catalyze change through this artworks aim to harness the power of imagination in his selected artworks and propel us toward a cosmopolitan vision. These artworks operate on multiple levels, revealing a complex and contradictory identity that Banksy portrays. For instance, showcases a striking juxtaposition between Palestinian and Israeli soldiers engaged in a pillow fight, symbolizing delicate balance between victimhood and oppression. This work will be a mere contradictory as it is present the Palestinian victims as an equal much to colonizer. This artwork attempts to deconstruct the scene of violence while simultaneously imagining an alternative reality that transcends the ongoing state of colonial violence, perpetuated by acts of murder, deviolation, and displacement carried out by the colonizers. It is important to recognize that this mentioned scenario does not arise out of nowhere, but it is rooted in historical foundation as suggested by Anderson. Furthermore, in Banksy's case, the power dynamic of colonialism and capitalism may shape this imaginative construction as those with authority possess the ability to dictate and influence through their nuance. Thus, Banksy's artworks not only critique that the existing power structures, but also offer a transformative vision of a world beyond the grip of colonial violence. Banksy's artworks incorporate diverse cultural references such as the inclusion of chimpanzee representing European culture and the absence of deer symbolizing Palestinian culture. This juxtaposition highlights the concept of uniformization, aiming to promote a single set of values globally through media and culture. Artworks serve as a tool for implementing and controlling the collective imaginary, shaping individuals and societies' ways of thinking and living. This control over imaginary allows ruling authorities or owners to guide it toward the desired culture pattern. In another instance, Banksy's paintings depict the sea throwing a life jacket onto the shore, symbolizing the refugees crisis faced by various groups, including Palestinian and Syrian. However, it is important to recognize that while Banksy addresses the refugees' experience, he inadvertently overlooks the specific and prolonged suffering endured by Palestinian refugees due to colonialism that has persisted for 75 years. This observation does not undermine the crisis faced by other refugees, but emphasize the importance of acknowledging the unique circumstances of each refugee situation. Nicholas Everett's book, Banksy's artwork, titled "We're All in the Same Boat." Portrays three boys pretending to be at sea, symbolizing unity and shared experience. The centerpiece of the artwork is a weathered piece of bright iron resembling a boat, and one boy's gaze toward that horizon, while another mimics emptying water from the sinking stream. That inscription, "We are all the same boat," possibly refers to the shared experience of pandemic. Banksy's artworks aim to balance that portrait of victims and oppressors while promoting love, peace, coexistence, and cosmopolitanism. Some artworks conceal the graphic and violence aspects of victims' suffering. For example, one piece depicts a child using a hammer to break down a wall while forming a love shape, symbolizing the pursuit of peace and the desire to overcome barriers. I love London Robot Car. Cheesewell Street, also in Bethlehem. Banksy's artwork, Cheesewell Street, features the Arab holding a placard symbolizing his affinity for stenciling the Arabs in different locations. Arabs despised and persecuted serve as inspiration for those who see marginalized as they possess the potential to bring civilization down despite the body state. In addition to the Iraq modified, Banksy's artwork explores the theme of self-reliance and its integration into modern society. The presence of security cameras and the concept of the Panopticon, as depicted in one of his artworks, reflected the mapping and controlling of the social body by institution. This process of self-reliance extends from closed discipline to a universally applicable mechanism resembling a form of social guarantee. Banksy's artwork exemplifies the transformation of art into platform for showcasing and disseminating civilized behavior throughout society. Through his artworks, Banksy seeks to foster a sense of empathy and cosmopolitanism by reflecting the struggle of different cultures and the experience of refugees worldwide. It is important to acknowledge that Banksy's art has also evolved into a business venture influenced by capitalist interests, intertwining with both Palestinian and popular culture. This has allowed Banksy's work to captivate and influence the thoughts and emotions of masses, exerting their control and shaping their actions. The evolution of artworks demonstrates shift from mere visibility to internalized control, where the focus is on making individuals visible within the artwork itself. The process serves as a mechanism for transforming individuals, exerting the influence, regulating behavior, and exercising power in order to bring about change. Artworks is sublimed as tools for civilizing and shaping the morals and conduct of the populace, often masquerading as symbols of tolerance and cosmopolitanism. This creates a new form of obedience that is presented as being imbued with freedom. However, As Chomsky argues, as society becomes more diverse and freer, the function of instilling subservience becomes more complex, posing challenges in addressing the mechanism of manipulation and indoctrination. Banksy efforts have a profound impact of human consciousness, promoting individuals to actively engage with the industry. This influence convinces them to accept the illusion presented by the industry, not as the mere compensation, but as a suggestion that they should be content with what is offered according to established. I don't know, argues that the culture industry fundamental business is that production models are based on what is presumed to be consumer needs therapy, explaining the acceptance of these models by the audience. Consequently, individuals attending Banksy shows a space that provides both acknowledge and statics a place for rigor and recreation. Thus, the culture industry hegemony serves as a means to encourage productive needs rather than contradict them according to them. This hegemony strives to encompass and regulate the entire spectrum of permissible and prohibited content, leaving no room for resistance of three sectors. Any individual or group that challenges this dominant narrative and fails to conform to it is risk exclusion from the system. Banksy's approach to art combines elements of present reality with an imaginary vision of detached future. His creation self new concept of control through simultaneity. However, this art from manipulate emotions thoroughly by inducing predetermined emotional state through the use of cliché. This manipulation highlights the counterfeit nature of culture production and the reception involved both the producer and the consumer allude in blurring the line between what is real and what is fake, convince each other that the emotions evoked by the artwork are profound, meaningful, and different. Thank you very much, and I'm so glad to be part of this conference.